Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. In the second half of our program, coming to you from the Conservative Leadership Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, we persuaded Michael Cannon, Director of Health Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, to duck into a hallway with us to discuss the subject of his presentation, the ever-changing law known as Obamacare. Despite news reports to the contrary, this is far from a settled debate. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Michael, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, remains very much in the news, on people's minds. There is a continuing series of changes that take place and are continuing to take place. There's a bunch of activity in the courts that are going on right now, which you've been following, and I would like to talk to you about that. But before we jump into the details, because it's so much like inside baseball when you get into Washington and look at it, I'd like you to look at the bigger picture. Obama has done quite a bit to expand the powers of the office of the president. He's using these powers without challenge. His supporters think that's fine. His detractors think that's not fine. But if these powers are left in place, what does that mean for future presidencies? Particularly, we have a Republican presidency who then inherits the powers that Obama left behind. What does this mean for America?
Well, I think we might want to start by backing up a little bit and admit that this is not just President Obama. This is a problem with all presidents. In fact, his predecessor did a lot to expand presidential power beyond what the framers of the Constitution envisioned. And he rightly received a lot of criticism from Democrats, from Senator Obama himself. Now that Senator Obama is President Obama, he has taken a kinder view toward executive power and done a lot to expand it. So the question is that a problem, and if so, why? And I think that it is a problem, not only because the president takes an oath to the Constitution and is supposed to abide by the limits on his or her own power under the Constitution, and not only because the president is less accountable to the people than Congress. So if the president tries to exercise some powers that are reserved solely to Congress, that's a big problem because he's less accountable. And the people have a harder time reining in abuses of those powers.
Well, particularly in a second term where he's not facing election again.
Right, but you'll notice that even with these concerns out there, when President Bush abuses his power or President Obama act beyond the scope of their constitutional powers, they've each got an amen chorus that says, right on, boss, way to go. The problem is that neither the Republicans who are applauding Bush's abuses of power, nor the Democrats that are applauding Obama's, seem to recognize that, wait, if we allow our guy to do this, then the next guy is going to do it as well.
These powers accumulate.
Right, they do. They almost never go away. And whoever's occupying the office next will be able to use and abuse those powers in ways that you don't like, even if you like the current occupant. And so one way to bring it home for Democrats is to say you might like that Kathleen Sebelius has so much discretionary power over how to implement Obamacare. Because never mind the things that the president is doing that they don't have the authority to do, even under the statute itself, the Secretary of Health and Human Services has a lot of discretion. But would you want the next Republican HHS secretary to have that power? I mean, what if that's Rick Santorum? Would you want him deciding what kinds of health insurance you have to buy and what kinds of insurance is allowed to be covered on health insurance exchanges under Obamacare? I think that would give a lot of Democrats a lot of pause. But you can't say we want Kathleen Sebelius to have that power without also implicitly admitting that, yeah, we're going to want Rick Santorum or someone else to have that power.
You could try to say it.
Well, they'll obviously say, no, we don't want him to have that power. Once you give it to...
The cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, the cat's out of the bag.
Let's drill down into the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the compromises that were made to get it through a very constrained legislative process, because they really put it through a knothole to make it happen, and the consequences of that as the act rolled out, particularly as it relates to Halbig versus Sebelius, the case that you're looking at very carefully, challenging the power of the presidency and the IRS to create taxes out of thin air. Why don't you roll us back to the legislation and take us forward?
Okay, we might as well then start right after the law was passed. Halbig is actually a very complicated issue.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's a simple issue that the government tries to complicate. But the abuses didn't start there. They began actually within days of the passage of the law because, remember, this is a bill that Speaker Pelosi said we have to pass it to find out what is in it. And the chief author of the bill, Max Baucus, admitted he hadn't read.
It was a work in progress, actually. I mean, many bills are works in progress until they go to committee.
Well, but this one was supposed to be reconciled with the House bill and go through even more vetting, but it didn't. And so a lot of people were surprised when they learned that the law throws members of Congress out of the health plan for federal employees on the day it took effect. That's what the statute says. They're barred from the federal employees' health benefits program on the day the statute takes effect. And President Obama just ignored that.
What's a line item veto?
He vetoed that, used an implicit line item veto to just ignore that part of the law. And that's troubling for a number of reasons. That's where it started. It's troubling for a number of reasons. It's troubling because he took an oath to uphold the law. And he's violating that oath. If he's deciding, I'm not going to enforce that. Congress spoke. He signed it. If he didn't want that to be the law, he shouldn't have signed it. But he did. He needs to abide by it. The rest of us have to abide by it. But I think another troubling dimension of this is why he decided to ignore this part of the law. And that is that if they wanted to correct that part of the law, if they wanted to put in a fix that says members of Congress can keep their health plans,
it would have opened the whole thing up.
It would have reopened the entire thing and been politically disastrous because Congress would have been giving itself an exemption and not giving the rest of the country an exemption.
Privileges.
And that would have affected outcomes in Congress, votes in Congress, because they would have reopened the entire law, and it would have affected the 2010 elections. Republicans might have gained even more seats if members of Congress tried to give themselves that fix without giving the rest of the country a fix. So the president was ignoring this part of the law to prevent Congress from reopening it, to affect votes in Congress, and to affect elections for Congress.
But basically turning it into a living law. People talk about the living Constitution. Now we seem to have living laws.
But that's not law is the thing. That's just power. It's arbitrary power. So that's how Obamacare began.
But he got away with it.
With the president. Exactly. And the reason he got away with it is because that action benefited not just Democrats in Congress, but also Republicans. They didn't want to be thrown out of their health plans either.
So they rolled over.
So they rolled over. And then this issue actually played itself out again in the latter part of 2013 because the law also strips from members of Congress, because the president said, all right, we're going to throw them out in 2014, and then they have to go into the exchanges. The law also takes away from members of Congress the federal government's contribution to their health insurance premiums. President Obama said, no, we're going to keep giving them that, even though the
so now he's doing appropriation without...
The executive agency in charge of those issues, the Office of Personnel Management, said, we don't have the authority to do that, so members of Congress, you don't get that money anymore. It was essentially a pay cut of thousands of dollars per year for members of Congress and their staffs, and there was a huge uproar. And John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, scheduled a private meeting with the president and told his staffers to tell the press if they found out that it was about something unrelated, so that no one would know that he was
colluded. Basically, the
that
Republicans and Democrats colluded to give him the power to make this a living law.
That John Boehner was colluding with President Obama to get members of Congress an unlawful exemption from Obamacare.
The precedent was set then, that basically they could make it up as they go along.
And again, the reason this happened was this part of the law threatened the most powerful constituency in Congress, which is Congress itself. So that's sort of how Obamacare began. And along the way, we've heard of all of these other ways the president has tried to tweak or rewrite the law.
Is that not right?
It's in the dozens now, maybe. But the biggest of them is the one that comes up in the lawsuit that you mentioned, which is Halbig v. Sebelius, and actually 3 other lawsuits that have been filed in federal court.
Stick to that one in terms of the building blocks. What was the congressional intent? What was the congressional language? And what's happening right now?
To understand this case, you've got to understand that when they were trying to get a bill through the Senate, they had to get 60 votes, and the only way they were going to get to 60 was if they made every one of the 60 Democrats happy, and some of those Democrats wanted the health insurance exchanges to be run by states rather than the federal government. Those were senators like Ben Nelson from Nebraska, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut. So they had to do that. In fact, the 2 major bills that they merged to create the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act both had exchanges run by states. They both told states, you have to run these exchanges. But that kind of creates a problem. As we learned in NFIB versus Sebelius, the case where the Supreme Court ruled on Obamacare, Congress can't force the states to implement federal programs. They can only.
This was the Medicaid get out.
That's right. They can only create incentives. Now, Congress knew this when they were crafting Obamacare.
And this is true with transportation law. This is true with any law. If you want to get your money for your highways, you have to make the drinking age 21. I mean, this has been going on for a long time.
Exactly. And so what Congress can do, they can't coerce states, but they can offer them incentives. And so
bribes and threats.
What they did was they said, all right, your residents will get subsidies through these exchanges, but only if you create one. And the language of the statute is very clear that those subsidies are available only, quote, through an exchange
So
established
this
by
was
the
done to
state.
force the hands of the state legislatures who would otherwise face the wrath of the voters for not getting those bennies.
Exactly. And those bennies are available only, quote, through an exchange established by the state.
Mm-hmm.
There's no authorization for those subsidies through a fallback exchange established by the federal government, which is what 34 states have right now because 34 states refused to create an exchange.
Which surprised everybody.
It surprised everyone. In fact, there's a Washington Post article about the implementation of the law, and on the list of problems that the Obama administration thought that they were going to face, resistance at the state level wasn't even on it.
Now, had they known that 34 states were going to balk on this, clearly they would have written the law differently.
Well, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure that they would have been able to. Remember, this passed by a razor-thin margin in Congress by one vote. And so they may not have been able to get it through if they tried to do federal exchanges or subsidies in federal exchanges. But be that as it may, the law, as Congress passed it, as Congress intended, says those subsidies only through state established exchanges. So what happened? Well, 34 states said no, but the Obama administration said we're going to issue those subsidies
anyway
in those 34 states with federal exchanges anyway. Now that's spending money without congressional authorization. That's creating a new entitlement to subsidies in federal exchanges that Congress opted not to create.
In Boston, didn't they used to call that taxation without representation?
The taxation comes in a moment. Under Obamacare's complicated machinery, those subsidies, the availability of those subsidies, the issuance and availability of those subsidies is what triggers penalties against employers under the employer mandate and lots of individuals under the individual mandate.
I see. To make it up.
So to make up part of it, so of that spending, so that if those subsidies are not authorized, such as in those 34 states,
then the taxes aren't there.
Then the taxes aren't either. But when the Obama administration issues those subsidies illegally in those 34 states,
the taxes.
It triggers illegal taxes. Now we're at taxation without representation, over which this nation fought its first war, and the people in Boston know a little something about that. So that's what makes this issue unlike all of the other ways that the president has rewritten Obamacare. It actually injures somebody. And that's why
does that matter?
That matters because if you want to sue to stop the Obama administration's illegal behavior, you need someone who's injured by it to get into court.
So if delaying or postponing or changing a bad law doesn't hurt anyone and helps people.
If I give you an exemption from a mandate, you're not injured by that.
So I can't
sue you. If I delay
you.
the onset of a burden, a regulatory burden, you're not injured by that. You're benefited by that. And so you can't file suit. And there have been some who've tried to file suit.
Isn't
but I don't think they're going to
isn't
get
that a
standing.
fascinating way to expand presidential power?
Well, it really is. But getting back to Halbig, you've got 4 lawsuits where employers and individuals have filed suit to stop the illegal taxes and spending that the president has created. And it's not a small amount of money that we're talking about.
How much is it altogether? 34 states?
Let's say no state established an exchange. We'd be talking about the president taxing, borrowing, and spending $1 trillion without congressional authorization over the next 10 years.
That still matters.
Because it's 34 states, it's somewhere between 500 and 700 billion. But that's, $100 billion here, $100 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. And a lot of that is going to be taxes imposed on people who, by law, are exempt from those taxes. So what happened last week was the D.C. Circuit, Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit.
So the lawsuit's working its way up.
Yes. So what happened last week was Halbig versus Sebelius made its way to the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And on a 3-judge panel, 2 judges were very, very skeptical of the government's case that an exchange established by the federal government was actually established by the state. That's what
they tried to change the language.
That's what the government was trying to argue, that this clear requirement of the law that in order to get a subsidy you have to be enrolled in health insurance, quote, through an exchange established by the state, actually authorizes them to provide subsidies through an exchange established by the federal government as well.
That's living language.
Well, it was amusing to hear the one judge that everyone thinks is the swing vote on this panel. I mean, really laboriously go through the language and force the government to admit that no, if the federal government establishes it, it wasn't established.
Now, do they have
the
the power to strike down the whole law, or just strike down this?
What's interesting about this case is that they're not asking the courts to strike down Obamacare. They're asking the courts to force the government to follow the law.
Oh, that's funny.
And it's ironic, and the Obama administration is fighting it tooth and nail because they know that this law is not sustainable. They know that Congress gave states the power to veto those subsidies. They know that those subsidies are what hides the cost of Obamacare from consumers. And they know that if those subsidies are not there, then the consumers who all of a sudden face the full cost of Obamacare are going to revolt.
So what happens if the plaintiffs win and the president is forced to follow the law, and he does? What happens?
Well, what's interesting is that the Obama administration has hinted to the court that even if the court tells them that what they're doing is illegal and they have to stop, they won't.
Well, then the Supreme Court will decide, right?
Well, yeah, the Supreme Court tried to tell Andrew Jackson that once, and he ignored them too. So that may set up a constitutional crisis. But what should happen is this. If the court rules against the Obama administration, the IRS will have to stop issuing those subsidies in 34 states. Consumers in those 34 states will then...
Who have already signed up.
Yes, who are already receiving those subsidies, those illegal subsidies,
they have to pay
will
them back?
lose them. I wouldn't want to come after them for that, go after them for that money. That's up to the court to decide, though. But they would stop receiving those subsidies. They would then be exposed to the
Their
full
bills would
cost
go
of Obamacare. Right, their premiums would
So they'd stop
would go
paying
up.
them.
It's not that their premiums would go up, but they would all of a sudden be on the hook for the full premium instead of being able to shift that cost to the taxpayer.
And they get a bill.
And they would go nuts. A lot of people, some economists estimate would see their premiums double. And if you think that the backlash against those health plan cancellations that we saw at the end of 2013 was big, I mean, and you got members, Democrats in Congress panicking and wanting to do something to fix this part of the law, that would be a hiccup compared to what would happen if the Obama administration had to implement the law as Congress intended. And they know that, and they're afraid of that because they know that Congress would have to reopen the law at that point.
So how does this play out? Whatever happens at the circuit court level, it's going to get appealed. It's going to have to get on the calendar of the Supreme Court. When is this likely to be finally decided?
No one knows. The court can take its time in issuing an
Certainly
opinion.
after the full elections.
Perhaps. So a lot depends on how the D.C. Circuit's three-judge panel rules. Because if they rule for the plaintiffs, then that is going to create a lot of uncertainty about Obamacare and educate a lot of people about this issue who don't already know about this issue, and
especially when they get their bills,
and cause a lot of panic. Now the government will probably ask, the Obama administration will probably ask for the ruling to be stayed, and they'll ask for an en banc ruling from the entire D.C. Circuit just to delay things.
So it has to go through another round.
So it has to go through another round before it would even get to the Supreme Court. And you can see why they would want to delay. Because the longer they delay a final disposition of these lawsuits, the more time they have to get people hooked on those illegal subsidies. Once they're hooked on those subsidies,
they're a constituency.
They're a constituency. They're going to want to vote to
was the whole
preserve those
plan.
subsidies. Well, it's funny you should say that. Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, was surprisingly candid about that, about how once you give people money from the government, they will vote for the people who will keep that money coming.
Yeah.
And that was one of their designs in creating this law.
Not just this law.
Well, that's true, but this law. Another reason, though, to delay the case is that the longer the case is delayed, the more people receive those subsidies, the more disruptive it would be for the courts to strike down those illegal subsidies, so that
they might hang back.
They're kind of hoping to prejudice the court a little bit that way.
Well, isn't that how they got through last time? I mean, what do you think swung Roberts around?
There is a lot of speculation that he was influenced by attempts to intimidate the court.
Those are pretty strong words, Michael.
I'm just saying there was speculation.
Fine. So let's look at two possible futures. Let's look at the possible future where the courts eventually force the administration to follow the law. What a concept. And chaos ensues. And the other one, which is the courts decide, no, the president doesn't have to follow the law. The president can pick and choose. The president can pass taxes on his own. The president can create entitlements on his own. And that's now established as a precedent. And then we have another presidential election, and a Republican takes power. What does that look like?
Well, in fairness to the president and his defenders, they will say, no, this president is not creating new taxes and spending money without congressional authorization. They will say that there are rules that allow the president to do so when a law like this one is passed. What they're doing is trying to bend pre-existing rules out of shape in ways that have the effect that you're talking about.
Bend it, don't mend it.
Have the effect that you're talking about that do result in taxes that Congress never authorized. But either way, the next Republican president will be able to use whatever bent out of shape rules the current president's defenders are trying to cite or establish in order to change federal law in a way that Republicans like. And we will move farther and farther away from the constitutional democracy that the framers created and toward a more authoritarian form of government. I think it might be an oversimplification, but not much of one, to say that in the Halbig versus Sebelius case and related cases, we're really facing a choice between Obamacare and democracy.
Implying we've given up a republic a long time ago, so the democracy is the fallback, because, again, democracy says 51% get whatever they want. Then they had 60%. And so what's the problem?
Well, I was using democracy as a shorthand because you're right. I mean, if you're talking about a pure majoritarian democracy,
which seems to be what a lot of people want.
To put a finer point on it, the choice is between Obamacare and a constitutional democracy.
Okay. Harkening back to where we started, isn't there a common thread to the way the president changed the law to benefit Congress to win their favor and the way he's changed the law in the Halbig cases?
There is. In both cases, what the president is doing is spending money without congressional authorization to influence votes in Congress and to influence electoral outcomes. We hear a lot about the need for clean elections, about the need for campaign finance reform, about the corrupting influence of money in politics. Yet what is this president doing? He's
spending direct. At least he's not going through lobbyists.
This president is spending money that he has no authorization to spend to give members of Congress subsidies to buy health insurance so that they won't vote to reopen Obamacare. And so that they won't try to fix that problem with the law in a way that causes a backlash against the people who voted for Obamacare and replaces them with people who will vote to repeal it. So he's trying to affect votes in Congress and electoral outcomes by spending money,
public money,
with taxpayer dollars that he's not authorized to spend. Same thing is happening in Halbig versus Sebelius. The president is issuing illegal subsidies in the 34 states with federal exchanges to hide from voters in those states the full cost of Obamacare. Because if he didn't, there'd be a backlash. Those voters
there'd be a cost. There'd be a political price to pay.
There'd be a backlash. Members of Congress who are right now not voting to repeal Obamacare might start voting to repeal Obamacare. So he's spending that money to affect votes in Congress. And he's also spending that money to prevent an electoral backlash against the people who put Obamacare in place. So he's spending this money to affect the makeup of Congress. What ties both of these things together is that they are incredibly cynical and corrupt efforts to spend taxpayer dollars without authorization to undermine democracy.
Michael, on that, I'll have to say thank you for your time. It's been interesting to be here with you today down at the Conservative Leadership Conference in Raleigh. We'll pick this up again in the future.
I hope we do. It's been a pleasure, Bill.
That wraps up this week's show. Thanks for joining us. We've been talking to Michael Cannon from the Cato Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, and I'd love to hear your feedback or suggestions for the program. So please drop me a note at bill@realclearradio.org. See you next week, same time, same station.